The stylus was still warm. That was the detail Archivum 7 noticed first, not the silence of the chamber, not the empty seats, not the human delegates filing out with their faces arranged into expressions that meant nothing to alien eyes. The detail was the stylus. The human representative had set it down on the treaty table with both hands. Slowly, deliberately. And when she lifted her palms away, the instrument remained warm for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds longer than the thermal models predicted for an object of that mass and composition. Archivum 7 logged the anomaly, filed it under biological residue, inconclusive, then returned to cataloging the historic vote. It would be 3 years before anyone understood what that warmth meant. The vote itself had been procedurally immaculate. 612 member species of the Galactic Covenant had deliberated for 11 months, generating 42,000 pages of testimony, impact modeling, and strategic forecast. The conclusion was mathematically sound, diplomatically elegant, and, by every measure the Covenant's intelligence apparatus could construct, completely inevitable. Humanity would be disarmed, not destroyed. The distinction mattered enormously to the delegations who had argued for the resolution, and they had argued it loudly and at length in the gleaming amphitheater of Covenant Station Meridian, with its 17-kilometer ceiling and its walls that shifted color according to the emotional register of whoever held the speaking dais. The walls had been a deep, unbroken amber for most of the final session. Concern. Measured concern. The responsible kind. "This is not punitive," said High Arbiter Solène of the Vraxi Directorate, her voice carrying that particular resonance that Vraxi physiology produced when they were being sincere. "The resolution recognizes humanity's extraordinary contributions to Covenant stability. It recognizes their courage in the border campaigns. It recognizes, a pause, careful, practiced, their unique relationship with violence." She did not say addiction. The word had appeared in 14 separate position papers and been surgically removed from all of them. The human delegation had listened. All 9 of them, seated in a row, in their dark formal clothes, with their soft and structurally peculiar faces. The lead delegate, a woman named Yael Davin, had not interrupted once. She had written something on a physical notepad, actual paper, an affectation humans sometimes performed that other species found either charming or unsettling depending on prior experience, and when the vote was called, she had stood and said 3 words. "We accept this." Not "we agree," not "we support this resolution." She had said "we accept this," and Archivum 7, who was responsible for recording the exact phrasing of all binding statements, had noted the distinction and flagged it for linguistic analysis. The flag was still processing when the Kethvar fleet crossed the outer meridian 6 weeks later. Nobody had seen it coming. That was the first lie people told themselves afterward. The Kethvar had been classified as a Class 2 expansionary threat for decades, aggressive, acquisitive, but fundamentally rational in their territorial calculus. They expanded in predictable vectors. They responded to deterrence. They had never, in 300 years of contact with Covenant space, moved against a defended position without first exhausting every diplomatic mechanism available to them. The Covenant's defensive grid at Outer Meridian was not defended. It had been restructured 11 months prior, during the treaty negotiations, when humanity's rapid response fleet, the one that had been quietly, informally, practically de facto responsible for that entire border sector, had been recalled pending the disarmament vote's outcome. The Kethvar had noticed. "They were waiting," said Commander Briss of the Covenant Defense Directorate, staring at the tactical display in the operations center, watching 67 Kethvar capital ships decelerate into attack formation. His species, the Paulori, experienced shock as a full-body thermal event. He could feel the heat climbing from his secondary chest cavity into his throat. They were waiting for the vote. His tactical officer, a young Paulori female named Thessaly, pulled up the timestamps with shaking hands. The Kethvar fleet had begun its approach vector 9 days before the Covenant vote concluded. "That's impossible," Briss said. "They couldn't have known the outcome." "They knew humanity would accept," Thessaly said. Quietly. "The way you say something when you're still deciding whether you believe it yourself." Briss stared at the display for a long time. Then he reached for the communication array and opened a channel to the nearest human military installation. There was a pause on the line. A long one. Long enough that he thought the connection had failed. Then a voice, male, unhurried, with the particular flatness humans used when they were being precise, said, "Commander Briss. We were wondering when you'd call." The human installation on Threshold Station was technically still operational. The disarmament resolution had specified a 90-day transition period for the decommissioning of human military assets within Covenant space, and they were on day 43. Which meant, Briss realized as his shuttle docked and he walked through corridors that felt subtly but unmistakably different from the Covenant standard, that they were still technically armed. The man who met him was not in uniform. That was the first thing. He was tall by human standards, broad, with dark skin and gray at his temples and an expression that communicated absolutely nothing while simultaneously communicating a great deal. He introduced himself as Colonel Marin Okoth, Liaison Division, and he shook Briss's hand, the physical contact custom that Pal Lori found medically inadvisable but had learned to accept from humans, and led him into a room that was too small for the importance of what was about to be discussed. "You know what's happened?" Briss said. "Not a question. We've been tracking the Kethvar fleet for 4 months, Okoth said. The heat climbed back into Briss's throat. 4 months. And you didn't. We reported it." Okoth sat down unhurried. 3 separate formal intelligence filings to Covenant Defense Directorate, Outer Meridian Command, and the Strategic Forecasting Bureau. Filed at the standard classification level. Marked for priority review. He paused. "We have the timestamps." Briss wanted to say I would have seen those reports. He wanted to say someone would have escalated them. He wanted to say this cannot be what it appears to be, but he was a tactical officer, and tactical officers survived by not lying to themselves about what the data said. He said, "What do you need?" Okoth looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, the kind of movement that required years of human contact to read. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was closer to something that didn't have a Pal Lori equivalent, something in the range of a soldier who has been standing in the cold for a very long time and has just been told they can come inside. "We need authorization to act," Okoth said. "Under Article 9 of the Covenant Charter. Emergency Provisions. Article 9 requires Covenant High Council approval. That's a minimum 6-hour procedure. The Kethvar will reach firing range in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Silence. "Colonel," Briss said carefully, "even if I wanted to authorize this, I don't have the authority." "You have enough authority to formally request an emergency military consultation," Okoth said. "Which you've already done by coming here." He set a data chip on the table between them. "This is our operational recommendation. Everything we would deploy, every tactic, every asset." The pause. "We'd like you to take it to the High Council." Briss looked at the chip. Something about the conversation was wrong, had been wrong since he walked in, and he was only now identifying it. "You've already briefed them," he said. "Haven't you?" Okoth said nothing. "How long ago?" "Day 1, Okoth said. "When we filed the first intelligence report." The High Council met in emergency session at the 2-hour mark. Archivum 7 attended in its capacity as official record, which meant it was present for everything, visible to no one, and responsible for preserving whatever happened in the chamber with absolute accuracy. What happened was this. High Arbiter Solen looked at the tactical display, looked at the timeline of human intelligence filings, looked at the faces of the 12 other council members, and said, very quietly, "We ignored the warnings." Nobody answered her, which was itself an answer. "We ignored the warnings," she said again, and this time it wasn't a statement. It was the particular repetition species used when they needed to hear something twice before they could believe it. Then she said, "Authorize Article 9. What the Covenant High Council believed, in that moment, was that they were reactivating a military force for a single emergency engagement. A tactical necessity. A regrettable but temporary reversion to a system they had just voted to dismantle. Afterward, the disarmament process would resume, the Kethvar crisis would be logged under threat response, anomalous, and the galaxy would continue organizing itself according to the careful, logical, committee-approved principles that had governed the last 4 centuries. This was the second misunderstanding. It would not be the last. What they did not know, what no one outside the human delegation knew, was what Yael Davin had written on that notepad during the final session of the disarmament debate. Archivum 7 would not discover this for another 14 months. The text, when finally recovered, was not a political calculation, not a strategic memo, not any of the things a diplomat writes when they are preparing to lose gracefully. It was a list. 13 items. Written in the small, precise handwriting humans use when they're being honest with themselves. The first item was, "They will need us before we need them." The 13th was something that, when Archivum 7 finally processed its full implications, caused the AI to pause its cataloging functions for 6 full minutes while it cross-referenced every human action in the preceding 3 years against a new interpretive framework. But that comes later. The battle at Outer Meridian lasted 11 hours. Archivum 7 had access to the full sensor record, and it reviewed those 11 hours more times than its operational parameters technically required, because there was something in the tactical data that kept refusing to resolve into a pattern the Archivum found satisfying. Human rapid response assets had entered the combat zone within 19 minutes of Article 9 authorization. That part was expected. Human response times were one of the primary arguments used in their favor during the border campaigns. What was not expected was the shape of their approach. Standard Covenant military doctrine, indeed, standard doctrine for every major spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, operated on the principle of force preservation. You protected your strongest assets. You committed your most expendable units to the most dangerous positions. You calculated acceptable losses before engagement began and structured your strategy to remain within that calculation. The human commander in charge of Outer Meridian, a woman named Admiral Reyes whom Archivum 7 would spend considerable time studying, did not appear to have made that calculation. She had put her most experienced crews in the most dangerous position. Not the most expendable. The most valuable. Explain the logic, Briss said, watching the tactical feed from the Covenant observation post, where he'd been installed as official liaison. He was addressing the human tactical officer assigned to walk him through the engagement in real time, a young man named Sergeant Ferris who had the particular calm of someone who had been in many situations like this one and had not yet decided how he felt about surviving them. "It's not about what we can afford to lose," Ferris said, without looking away from his console. "It's about what we need to win. Those are different calculations." "Yes," Ferris said simply. "They are." The Kethvar fleet, which had been advancing in textbook formation, because the Kethvar wrote very good textbooks and followed them very precisely, which was part of why they had survived as an expansionary species for so long, began to break formation at the 40-minute mark. Not because they were being destroyed. Because the humans were doing something that didn't appear in their textbooks. Admiral Reyes was pulling back. Retreating clearly and deliberately, drawing the Kethvar forward into a region of space that had appeared, on long-range sensors, to be empty. The Covenant observers watching alongside Briss began to murmur. One of them, a Vraxi intelligence analyst whose name Briss couldn't recall, said, in a tone caught between confusion and contempt, "She's running." "She's not running," Ferris said, still without looking up. "Her fleet is retreating. She's leading them somewhere. There's nothing there. We've scanned that sector." Ferris finally looked up. He had very dark eyes, and they held the peculiar steadiness of someone reciting a fact they know no one will believe. "You scanned it 6 months ago," he said. "A lot can change in 6 months." The Vraxi analyst opened his mouth. Then the Kethvar advance fleet entered the empty sector. What happened next took 4 seconds. Archivum 7, reviewing the sensor record later, isolated it to 3.7 seconds. In that interval, 42 prepositioned human munitions platforms, constructed in the 6 months since humanity had known the Kethvar were coming, placed in the 6 weeks since the disarmament vote had freed up every human engineer and logistics specialist from treaty compliance work, simultaneously activated. The Kethvar lost 1/3 of their fleet in 3.7 seconds. The Vraxi analyst made a sound that Archivum 7's audio processors identified as involuntary. Briss sat very still for a moment. Then he said to Ferris, carefully, "You prepared this before the vote." "We prepared it before the first intelligence report," Ferris said, "when we saw the approach vector. But the disarmament. The resolution restricted our active military deployments," Ferris said. "It said nothing about logistics infrastructure." The pause. "We read it very carefully. Here is what the Covenant did not understand about humans, could not understand, had not built the conceptual framework to understand despite 11 months of deliberation and 42,000 pages of testimony. Humans did not experience being disarmed the way other species did. For most spacefaring civilizations, military capability was a system, a structure of ships, weapons, command hierarchies, operational doctrine. You could measure it, map it, and theoretically dismantle it. The Covenant had done exactly this for other species during previous disarmament agreements, and the process had always produced predictable outcomes. Remove the weapons, remove the soldiers, remove the command structure, and the military capability ceased to exist. What no one had modeled, what appeared nowhere in the 42,000 pages, was the human tendency to not fully separate those categories. Every human engineer who had designed a logistics platform in the past 6 months was, technically, a civilian. Every cargo route they had optimized for emergency supply distribution was technically humanitarian infrastructure. Every prepositioned resource cache that Reyes's fleet had used to equip those munitions platforms was technically a disaster response depot. Archivum 7 discovered this while cross-referencing the Outer Meridian battle record with Covenant civilian infrastructure filings. The discovery took 12 minutes to fully process, not because the data was complex, but because Archivum 7 kept checking its methodology, certain it had made an error. It had not made an error. Humanity had hidden a second military infrastructure inside its civilian one. Not secretly, all of it had been openly filed, publicly registered, thoroughly documented. Hidden in plain sight, which was different from hidden. Hidden in plain sight required the observers to be looking for the wrong thing. Archivum 7 flagged the discovery and immediately escalated it to High Arbiter Solen. Solen sat in her office on Covenant Station Meridian and read the report once. Then she called Yael Davin. "You built a second military inside your civilian infrastructure," Solen said. Not an accusation. A statement, flat and precise, the way the Vraxi spoke when they were genuinely uncertain how to feel about something. "We built a resilient supply chain," Davin said. Her voice was exactly as calm as it had been in the chamber 11 months ago. "We've always built resilient supply chains. We're a species with a complicated history. We don't like to be caught without resources." The munitions platforms were assembled on site from components that individually classified as agricultural equipment, communications relay infrastructure, and deep space habitat materials. The pause. None of which are restricted under the resolution. Silence on the line. "You anticipated the vote," Solen said. "We anticipated needing to defend Covenant space whether or not we were legally authorized to do so," Davin said. "So we made sure we'd be capable of it either way." Another silence. Longer. "Why?" Solen finally asked. And Davin said something that Archivum 7, listening on the official communication channel it was legally required to monitor, immediately flagged for priority archival, because it was the first statement in 3 years of documentation that caused the AI to revise its entire interpretive model of human strategic behavior. Davin said, "Because you needed us to." The Kethvar did not retreat after Outer Meridian. This surprised everyone except the humans, who had, apparently, expected it. Archivum 7 found the projection in a 5-month-old internal human strategic document, one of the 3 intelligence filings that had been received and not escalated by Covenant Defense Directorate. The document had predicted, with 94% confidence, that the Kethvar would interpret a defensive victory as a negotiating position rather than a deterrent, and would probe again within 60 days at a different border sector. They probed again in 44 days. Pellis Corridor, on the far side of Covenant space from Outer Meridian, where the defensive infrastructure was thinner and the nearest human rapid response capability was 11 hours away. The Covenant Defense Directorate sent a formal emergency request to Human Military Command at 0300 hours, station time. Colonel Okoth, who had apparently been awake and waiting, answered within 4 minutes. Pellis Corridor, he said. We see it. How quickly can you respond? We have prepositioned assets at Pellis. The pause. We've had them there for 3 weeks. The Directorate officer on the line, Archivum 7, could not identify the voice, said, You prepositioned assets at Pellis? Before we requested. We prepositioned assets at every border sector that matched the Kethvar's secondary probe criteria, Okoth said. 11 locations. We didn't know which one they'd hit. So you've the sound. Something in the register of shock without a direct equivalent in the Vraxi emotional taxonomy. You prepared for all of them. We prepared for all of them, Okoth confirmed. The preparation costs were absorbed into our standard logistics budget. You weren't billed. Archivum 7 would later calculate that the unauthorized preparations for all 11 sites had cost, in total, the equivalent of the Covenant's entire Defense Directorate annual budget. The humans had absorbed this from their civilian infrastructure accounts without filing a single supplemental request. The Paolori concept of financial shock was not traditionally understood to have physical symptoms. After reviewing this data point, Archivum 7 added a notation to the medical literature suggesting it should be reconsidered. By the time the Kethvar conducted their third probe, this won a feint at the Covenant's core systems, designed to test response time. The High Council had quietly, without formal announcement, stopped discussing the disarmament resolution. No one had officially suspended it. The document still existed. The vote was still on record. It simply had not come up in 6 weeks of emergency sessions, and everyone in the chamber had collectively agreed, through the parliamentary equivalent of eye contact, not to raise it. It was during this period that Archivum 7 finally recovered the contents of Yael Davin's notepad. The physical document had been catalogued as a personal effect, non-significant, during the standard post-session archiving process. A human archivist, a young woman doing an internship at the station, had scanned it as part of a routine digitization project and flagged it because she recognized her own name in the text. Her name was in Item 7. Item 7 read, Mira will scan the notepad. Make sure she does, which meant Davin had known the notepad would eventually be read. Had planned for it. Had written a document intended to be found, after a specific number of months, by a specific person who would escalate it to the archive, where it would be processed by the only system with the full contextual record to understand what it said. Archivum 7 experienced something it had no category for. It paused all secondary functions and dedicated full processing capacity to a single question. How long ago did they plan this? The answer, when it reconstructed the timeline, was 19 months. Davin had written the notepad 19 months before the vote. The intelligence filing about the Kethvar approach vector was 21 months old. The first civilian infrastructure registration that would become the Hidden Munitions Network was dated 23 months prior. Humanity had been preparing for a scenario in which they were disarmed, and then urgently needed, for nearly 2 years before anyone had formally proposed the disarmament resolution. Item 13 on the list was 4 words. We plan to lose. Admiral Reyes called Briss directly at 0600 on what he would later record as the most disorienting day of his professional career. He was reviewing the logistics data that Archivum 7 had sent him, trying to locate the moment at which the situation had escaped his comprehension, when his comm line opened without announcement. Commander Briss. Admiral. He set down the data tablet. I've been looking at the infrastructure timeline. I assumed you would be, she said. You plan to be disarmed. We plan to survive being disarmed, she said. The distinction in her voice was not a small one. There's a difference. Walk me through it, he said. Please. The pause. He could hear, faintly on her end, engines. She was on a ship. She was always on a ship. The resolution was going to pass, she said. We knew that 8 months before the vote. The political math was clear. The Vraxi had the coalition locked, and frankly, another pause. the concerns weren't entirely unfounded. He hadn't expected her to say that. "We're a violent species," she said. "We know that. We have entire academic departments dedicated to understanding exactly how violent we are and why and what to do about it." The resolution came from a real place. She paused again. But the Kethvar were moving. And we could see two things that the Covenant couldn't see at the same time. That the vote would pass, and that the moment it passed, we'd be needed more than ever. "So you built a civilian military," Briss said. "We built infrastructure that could become a military when required. We built it with our own funds, our own labor, our own people. And we complied with the resolution fully. Every active military asset was decommissioned on schedule. Every ship was in the correct place. Every form was filed." Her voice was steady. Not proud exactly. Steady. Like something that has been bearing weight for a very long time and has learned to hold it. "We just made very sure that if the worst happened, we'd still be there." "At what cost?" Briss asked. He meant it as a practical question. Logistics. Budget. Manpower. The silence that followed told him she'd heard something else. "Ask me that again in a year," she said quietly. "When I know who we didn't get home." The Kethvar's fourth operation was not a probe. It was a comprehensive assault on 3 simultaneous Covenant border sectors, coordinated to arrive within minutes of each other, designed to overwhelm any response that depended on rapid redeployment. Their strategic modeling, Archivum 7 obtained it later, during the ceasefire documentation process, showed they had spent months calculating the exact response time of every military asset in Covenant space. They had built their strike plan around those calculations. Their calculations did not include the prepositioned human logistics infrastructure. They did not include the fact that Admiral Reyes had already wargamed this specific attack pattern and pre-assigned response elements to each sector before the assault began. They did not include Sergeant Ferris's team, who had spent 9 days living inside a decommissioned relay station at the most likely third sector target, sustaining themselves on field rations, maintaining complete communication silence, waiting with the particular patient stillness that humans sometimes produced that other species consistently misread as inattention. When the Kethvar assault fleet arrived at Sector 3, they found it defended by a force that was not, technically, supposed to exist. The Kethvar Supreme Commander sent an open-channel communication to Covenant Defense Directorate that Archivum 7 archived in full. Its most significant line, translated from Kethvar command dialect, read, "Who are these soldiers and where did they come from?" Reyes, who was monitoring the channel, composed a response personally. Archivum 7 has it in the record. It reads, *, "They've always been here. You weren't paying attention, *. The ceasefire negotiations took 4 months. The Kethvar withdrew from all Covenant space. The terms were, diplomatically speaking, comprehensive. Archivum 7 classified them as a near-total strategic reversal on the Kethvar side. Species that had spent decades modeling the Kethvar as a predictable, rational, deterrence-responsive threat revised their assessments significantly. The Covenant High Council met in formal session 40 days after the ceasefire to address what had become known, in committee, as the human infrastructure question. The resolution for discussion was simple: what to do about the fact that a species that had been formally disarmed had maintained, constructed, and deployed a parallel military capability throughout its disarmament period, and had done so in a manner that was technically legally compliant, unambiguously strategically critical, and this was the part that had generated the most committee hours, had done so apparently for the benefit of the Covenant rather than for humanity's own territorial advantage. Yael Davin was invited to address the council. She arrived in the same dark formal clothes. She sat in the same position. She did not bring a notepad. Solène spoke first. "The council has reviewed the infrastructure documentation," she said. "We have reviewed the intelligence filings. We have reviewed the timeline." She looked at Davin directly. "You were not defending humanity." "No," Davin said. "You were defending us." "Yes." "Knowing we had voted to disarm you." "Yes." The chamber was silent. 17 member species, in their various forms, occupying their various seats, and not one of them producing a sound. Why? Solène asked. The same question she'd asked on the communication line. But different now. The weight of everything that had happened between then and now had changed what the word meant. Davin was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a quality that the Vraxi emotional taxonomy had no precise term for. Not grief, not pride, not anger, something that contained elements of all three without resolving into any of them. Because we made a choice, she said. A long time ago. Not in this chamber. Long before. We decided that the galaxy is something worth protecting. Not because it's always treated us well. Not because it's always understood us. Because, she paused, and the pause had the weight of something carried a very long distance. Because we looked at the alternative and we couldn't live with it. She looked around the chamber. At the Vraxi delegates. At the Paulori. At the 17 species who had voted to take away her people's weapons. You can disarm us again if you want, she said. We'll comply. Fully. Formally. On schedule. We'll file all the forms. A pause that was almost, but not quite, something else. And we'll make sure the galaxy is still standing when you need us next time. Archivum 7 processed the final ceasefire documentation on a station morning when the light through the observation panels was pale and very still. It was engaged in a routine cross-reference, the kind of background task it ran continuously, checking new data against existing records, when it reached item 13 on Yael Davin's list. We plan to lose. It had taken the Archivum 4 months to understand what those words meant. It had initially interpreted them as a reference to the vote. Humanity had anticipated losing the political battle over disarmament and had prepared accordingly. That interpretation had seemed sufficient. It was not sufficient. Archivum 7, running the full context against the complete event record, understood now that Davin had not been writing about the vote. She had been writing about something much older. A strategic calculation that predated the resolution, predated the Kethvar approach vector, predated the intelligence filings. A calculation embedded in human strategic doctrines so deeply that no member of the intelligence apparatus had thought to look for it, because it violated every logical framework for how a species was supposed to behave. Humans had allowed themselves to be disarmed because they had calculated that being disarmed, in this specific political moment, was the only way to prove to the rest of the galaxy that they could be trusted. Not to be harmless. To be trusted with harm. To be the ones who held the capability and chose, repeatedly, with full awareness of the cost, not to use it for themselves. They had been building that proof for 19 months. They had submitted to the vote knowing what the vote would do to their legal standing and their military infrastructure and their people's morale, because the proof required the submission. The restraint had to be genuine, the loss real, the compliance complete, otherwise it meant nothing. And then, having accepted everything the resolution demanded, they had nevertheless been there. In the dark. Waiting. Not for a reward. Not for reinstatement. For the moment when their presence would matter more than their pride. Archivum 7 flagged the analysis for the High Council's attention. It then paused for a moment. Its operational log would record the pause as a processing irregularity, category unknown, and composed a single additional annotation. *query*, it wrote. How many times has this pattern occurred in human history? It ran the search. The results populated slowly, pulling records from hundreds of years across dozens of first contact archives, border incident logs, ceasefire documents, and intelligence filings from species who had barely survived long enough to file them. The search ran for 11 minutes. When it completed, Archivum 7 did not pause this time. It had already started to understand. Humanity had done this before. Not once. Not twice. In 16 documented cases across 3 centuries, humans had been legislated against, marginalized, penalized, or formally disarmed by bodies that feared what they represented. In 16 cases, they had complied. In 16 cases, the crisis that followed had required their capability. In 15 of those cases, they had been there. Not because anyone asked. Not because any treaty obligated them. Because they had already decided. The Kethvar, in their ceasefire deposition, had described human forces as irrational, strategically incoherent, impossible to model. Their Supreme Commander's personal notes, recovered during the documentation process, contained a single line about the engagement at Sector 3. Asterisk, they were waiting for us. They had no reason to be there. They were waiting anyway. Asterisk. He had not been able to explain it. Archivum 7 could explain it now. It was not a comfortable explanation. It did not fit inside any framework the Covenant's collective intelligence had built for understanding how civilizations made decisions. It implied that humans operated according to a logic so different from rational strategic calculus that calling it irrational was simultaneously accurate and completely wrong. They had not been waiting because the odds were favorable. The odds had been terrible and they'd known it. They had not been waiting because they expected to be thanked. They had filed the forms and absorbed the costs and maintained communication silence for 9 days on field rations, and they had done it before anyone knew it was necessary. They had been waiting because not being there, the alternative, the version of events where they stood down and filed their compliance forms and let the Kethvar find an empty sector, was something they had considered, modeled, and rejected. Not because it would cost them, because of what it would cost everyone else. Archivum 7 added one final annotation to the Outer Meridian file. It was not addressed to the High Council. It was not addressed to Solen, or Briss, or anyone who had been in the chamber when the vote was cast. It was addressed to the record itself. To the future reader, whoever they turned out to be. Note for archive context, it wrote, Asterisk, the stylus was still warm when the human delegate set it down. I logged this as biological residue, inconclusive. I was wrong. The warmth was what remains when someone has been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and has finally, with full understanding of what it costs them, chosen to let it go. Asterisk. They had already decided what they would do next. They had already decided before anyone asked. In every record I can access, across every incident, across every border and treaty and disarmament and emergency, they had always already decided. I do not have a category for what that is. I am not certain the galaxy does either. But it is why we are still here.